Go ahead and get. All right, so we are recording this meeting so that it can be posted on the Middle Fork Greenway's website, and it can be viewed for the next 10 days. There'll be a point where you can provide your input on a public input survey. So that'll also be available. So I welcome you to the Middle Fork Greenway's feasibility study update. I'm really excited to be able to share this information with all of you. It was really a wonderful opportunity. The NCDOT got in touch with the Greenway last year and said, we'd like to fund some studies for you. And so the Watauga County and Blue Ridge Conservancy took them up on it and have partnered with McAdams Engineering. And McAdams has just done a fantastic job so far, putting together ideas and alignments and potential routes for the Middle Fork Greenways sections that are still to be determined. So welcome to our study today. And this is a picture of the bridge that was installed on the Middle Fork Greenway last fall over there on the 321 trailhead. So just a couple of housekeeping items today. If you can stay on mute, that will be great. We're recording this, so we'll want to make sure we have good clarity. Links will be provided for your input at the end, and those input opportunities will also be on the Middle Fork Greenway's website by the end of the day today. And then we'll also provide our contact information, my information and McAdams information for follow-up questions if you have them. We can try to clarify anything. There's a lot of information going to be presented today. So our agenda, I'm going to give a brief update and introduction, and then we'll have a couple of different speakers from McAdams talk about the study area, the study schedule, kind of the opportunities that are presented in the corridor, but also, as many of you know, there's many constraints. And McAdams came up here and did a field visit and took some pictures, has some opportunities and observations there. So we're also going to go over what a typical cross section would look like of a greenway, some route alternatives that are specific to this area. In the evaluation criteria, there's actually a lot of different factors that go into determining how a route is chosen and selected. So we'll go over that. And then the input opportunities in the survey for everyone to provide their input. It's really important that we have your input as this feasibility study goes as part of the requirements for the North Carolina DOT. And so we want to make sure that we have input from the community. So any kind of questions that you have or even ideas or observations are welcome in that survey. So I wanted to start us off with just a quick kind of overview of the Greenway. And many of you know Blue Ridge Conservancy took the leading role to develop the Greenway about six or so years ago, and has been partnering with the town of Boone on one end and the town of Blowing Rock on the other end, and Watauga County, the whole section in between. So we've broken the Greenway corridor up into 6 sections. And within each of those sections, there are multiple phases. So as many of you know, section 4 here, we have 4 phases within that one section. So it gets to be there's a lot of details in each section, but it's really fortunate that we can partner with all these municipalities to work on these sections. We're working really hard to get as much trail on the ground as possible. We believe the more that we can get on the ground, the more momentum we'll have, the more of a catalyst it'll be to get more on the ground. So working with willing landowners, it's all voluntary. So anything that you see with lines on papers, it's all still out to be determined, and it's all voluntary work. So where our funding is coming from is multiple sources, but the majority of the funding is coming from state and federal grants to build this trail out. And 25% of the funding has come from Watauga County Tourism Development Authority. That is the kind of heads and beds tax that we talk about, and we can apply for funding with that board. And it's been really helpful to match those state and federal grants. Also, 25% of the funding for the Greenway has come from private foundations, donations, roundup for the Greenway. So every dollar that's given to the Greenway is actually used as match for those state and federal grants. So if you gave $25 to the Greenway, that actually is doubled to $50. So every dollar counts when talking about fundraising for the Greenway Trail. So right now, kind of an update of where we are with the Greenway. We've got 2 trailheads on the ground, one in Blowing Rock, one on Highway 321. The 321 trailhead was just constructed and finished last year. We're finalizing the planting actually next week. So the rain garden and all those landscape beds will be completed in this month in May. We're waiting for that frost to stop. So those 2 trailheads are kind of setting the precedent for what the Greenway looks like, kind of its branding, and knowing that you're on the trail when you see those logos. We have 3 pocket parks already developed. The Payne Branch Park, where the dam was removed off of Payne Branch Road back in 2020. Sterling Creek Park is another area with picnic areas and access to the river. And then our most recent park is Gold Mine Branch Park, which has some parking areas that connects to the 321 trailhead. So these are all already open and ready for folks to enjoy. We have about 2 miles of trail on the ground. So everything from asphalt to natural surface sections. So they're already being used, open for the public to take their dogs, kids, strollers, wheelchairs, go out and enjoy those sections of the river and the Greenway. So far, we've protected about 85 acres in the corridor through conservation easements and purchases. We have kind of a variable number of what still needs to be acquired, and it depends on the routes. And so as you'll see in the next presentations, there's multiple different ways that this can be conducted. And so we've acquired the 20, and we still need anywhere from 7 to 19 tracks to complete the Greenway. Right now we have 2 miles in progress. So the Blowing Rock section from Tanger Outlets through the Foley Center, we're working with the Blue Ridge Parkway to get our environmental assessments and all of our permitting completed. And we have 4 possible potential alternate routes through that section, as you can see on the left part of your screen. We're kind of vetting through all those different routes right now with the Blue Ridge Parkway. So that could be anywhere from 1.2 to 1.8 miles. And then the Tweesey connector underneath Highway 321, that is not a long section, but it's a critical section that we are working with our state permitting agencies to get underneath the highway to connect the Tweetsy parking lot over here to the natural surface section that's being constructed this year. So this is underway right now. We have the funding for this underpass. We have almost the final designs and almost the permitting. So we're kind of waiting on some key little factors there to get that completed. So right now, what today's discussion is this 2 miles of feasibility studies that were funded by the North Carolina DOT and is being conducted by McAdams Engineering. The one section is on the Boone side, which looks at from Appalachian Regional Healthcare, this Watauga Medical Center here, which would connect to the Boone Greenway, which is all this network up here, connecting this section to Niley Cook Road, where we just completed that Gold Mine Branch Park. So from Gold Mine Branch Park on Niley Cook Road all the way to the hospital is one of the feasibility studies. The second one goes from where Sterling Creek Park dead ends right now through Aho Road. So this section right here is a little bit smaller than the section 5, but this is still a really, it's complex, but it's also a really critical area. So I'm really excited to have McAdams present on what a feasibility study is and kind of our next steps with this. So I'm going to stop my share here and pass the torch over to McAdams Engineering for their presentation.
Thanks, Wendy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Alrighty, let me share my screen real quick. All right, can you guys see that?
Yep.
Awesome. All right, so thanks again. My name's Andrew Hickling. I'm with McAdams. We've been working with NCDOT and Wendy on the feasibility study. I want to take a quick moment just to kind of go over what a feasibility study is and where it kind of fits in the overall life cycle of a project. So you can kind of see the life cycle up at the top there. It kind of starts with planning. Feasibility is kind of in between planning, funding, and design. And then, of course, construction at the end. And so what we're doing are building upon higher level planning efforts. Planners have come up with your all master plan. Now it's time to bring in some engineers and kind of vet some of those fat lines, understand how much they're going to cost. So we're going to take a comprehensive look to identify possible alignment alternatives, evaluate those from a technical feasibility standpoint, both from the design, permitting, and constructability perspectives. Solicit inputs from the community and other stakeholders on those alignment alternatives. And then we're going to develop quantity-based cost estimates. So at the planning level, you might get a cost per mile, a big fat line type cost estimate, but we're going to actually model these alternatives and use those to develop actual quantities, use that with the bid tabs from other recently bid Greenway projects to get kind of a better estimate of what each of these alternatives would cost to help inform the decision-making, identify funding needs, and then identify the next steps for any project implementation. And so just a quick note at the bottom again, feasibility study is not a final design for construction, and any final alignment would be determined based on willing property owners and available funding. So real quick, just kind of an overview of the study schedule. We got started back last fall with the existing conditions phase. That's when we did a lot of data gathering, both digital and in the field. And then in January through March, we kind of did our route analysis, took what we learned in the field and from our electronic analysis there to develop some route alternatives. March through May, that's kind of where we are now, developing study recommendations. So I've been working on typical cross sections, the public meeting that's highlighted, that's where we are right now, working towards some recommended routes, might be multiple for a given segment, depending on how things shake out implementation wise. And then between now and July, working on drafting the actual study report, coming up with the project cut sheets and working towards ultimate study adoption. So when we look at a feasibility study and the existing conditions, what we're trying to consider, it kind of falls into three buckets. There's like the planning level, natural environment considerations, and then the human or built environment considerations. And starting with the planning level considerations, these are the higher level considerations, and we start with kind of a review of the previous planning efforts. So that would include the Middle Fork Greenway master plan that you see over on the left, but also any other plans, looking at existing and planned bicycle and pedestrian facilities in municipalities along the corridor, revisiting that desired connectivity to make sure that we're hitting the mark there, understanding any bicyclist and pedestrian crash data, and then also looking at the NCDOT STIP to see if they have any projects in the corridor that might be able to accommodate certain segments of the Greenway. We move into the environmental and kind of the more human environment constraints. We're looking at topography. That's a very big thing, big constraint, and we're also part of the states, jurisdictional features. It could be rivers, streams, wetlands, that kind of thing. Trout stream buffer. So Middle Fork is a trout stream, so there's certain buffers, undisturbed areas associated with that. Looking at the FEMA floodway and floodplain. So there are already insurable structures within the floodway along sections of the river there. So anything that we do can't create a rise in that floodplain elevation and have any impact on those existing structures. Property impacts, land acquisition, that kind of thing. Utility impacts, both aerial, like power lines, and any kind of underground utilities, whether it's sanitary gas, that kind of thing. Roadways in the corridor. So when we're looking at roadways, when we need to get across them, we're looking at things like traffic volume, speeds, and sight distance. Structures, these are things like bridges, boardwalks, tunnels, and walls, knowing where and if we need those, because those can drive the cost of the project up rather quickly. Constructability, so not just looking at it from does the line fit on the page, but how do you build the line? So understanding, the amount of room it takes to bring a crane in, have a staging area, set a bridge, that kind of thing. understanding traffic control that might be required on any roadways during construction, and understanding if there are any kind of geologic features like rock that would be harder to excavate. Drainage and erosion control, so want to make sure that everything drains well and doesn't create any problems for any adjacent landowners. Cost effective, always trying to keep that hat on, and then long-term maintenance, not just looking at what's the quickest way to get it on the ground right now, but also making sure that what we put down is going to last and not become a large burden from a maintenance perspective. So those are the kind of things that we were looking at and had in mind when we did our field visit last fall with Wendy and Joe and the rest of our team here at McAdams. So I wanted to kind of share some of our field visit observations and how they relate to those opportunity and constraints that I just shared. So beginning at segment 3, this is the Ajo Road to Sterling Creek Park section. On the left-hand side, you'll see a photo. This is from Ajo Road looking south towards kind of the area behind the mustard seed. And it's the same thing on the right-hand side, just a little bit further down. This is an area where there's a proposed river crossing to get over on the Faith Bridge parcel and head south towards Blowing Rock. So understanding that we would ultimately need a bridge crossing here, just looking at things like you've got utility lines there. There's also some underground utilities. So just keeping that in mind and understanding when we site that bridge, where it is and making sure that we're not going to have to move anything to get it in. Next slide here, we've kind of turned around and now we're facing the north. So on the left-hand side, you see the Ajo Road Bridge that NCDOT replaced. You can kind of see a bench on the left-hand side underneath. We would look to grade and utilize that bench, so we'd have a grade separated crossing there. On the right-hand side, this is just as you pop out the other side of the underpass there and you turn to the west and look towards 321. You can see when NCDOT replaced the bridge, they raised the roadway grade on the approach there and had to put back the entrance, and it's rather steep. So that that's a constraint if we were to try and go in that direction with the trail that we would have to deal with. Continuing to the north here, on the left-hand side, you can see this is kind of the flat terrain. The river's on the left side of that photo, and then the kind of antique small building is on the right. So we've got some flat terrain that we could kind of potentially follow the river there, but just again, considering any kind of impacts to business operations, you see the loading docks of the building there. So anything that would be put down would need to be coordinated and make sure that we're not creating any kind of unacceptable impacts to business operations. And then kind of turning around in that same spot and facing north, this is US 321 up on the top side of the photo there. The river's on the right-hand side of the photo. You can kind of see the roadway embankment coming down. If we were to try and follow along 321, we've got a little bit more topography there. And then we've got some pretty substantial transmission lines and poles to deal with at that point. So as we kind of continue north and head up, we're now on the left-hand photo standing on Mac Hampton Road, looking west up towards 321. So again, you can see a lot of aerial utility lines, poles, and the guy wires coming down to the ground that we'd have to deal with. And then there's also an RV storage site that any kind of land acquisition might need to be coordinated to get an easement through for the Greenway. The photo on the right-hand side, that's just to the north of this RV storage site. We've kind of hopped over to the the east side of the river at this point. That's the existing roadbed for Jennifer Lane. So looking at potentially using that, paving that, and using that as the alignment for the trail. The advantage there would be that it would be kind of minimal grading required to do that. As we continue north along Jennifer Lane, though, we do run into a spot where there's kind of significant riverbank erosion that you'll see in the left-hand side photo there that's starting to undermine that roadbed. So if we were to use that for the Greenway, we'd need to either do some sort of slope armament or potentially do kind of a stream restoration project that might involve some realignment of the stream. There's a lot of federal money out there right now. Might actually look at doing a stream restoration project kind of for the length of that entire parcel that the Conservancy already owns, but just an option there and something to consider. And then last for segment 3 here on the right-hand side, This photo is taken from the end of the existing greenway at Sterling Creek Park, and the river's just in the background there with the mountain behind. So this is another area where we would need a bridge to cross the river and connect up to Dexter Drive. Moving on to segment 5, like Wendy mentioned, this is a lot longer segment, so we kind of divided this into 2 sections. Segment 5 South is what we're going to talk about here. Gold Mine Branch Park and Niley Cook Road up to Payne Branch Park. So on the left-hand side, you see the Gold Mine Branch parking area. The river is kind of on the left-hand side there. Niley Cook is on the right. You see the aerial utilities there, a lot of guy wires coming down. Not a whole lot of room between the road and the river. That comes into play when we're looking at things like trout stream buffers. The photo on the right is looking in the same direction, but this time from Niley Cook Road along that road corridor. So again, river on the left. See the transmission lines and the guy wires. Again, not a whole lot of room between Niley Cook and the river. As we continue to make our way north along Niley Cook Road, we're kind of turning and looking a little bit to the west here. You'll notice there are already existing buildings along right up against the edge of the west bank of the river. So that kind of limits our ability to do anything on that side of the river, adjacent to the river. And then you'll see, again, just the transmission lines, guy wires, and see the transmission easement kind of continuing up the hill there as it passes Mine Branch Road. And then you can see that there's some exposed rock embankment there, something to consider when we're looking at alignments through this area. Continuing further along Niley Cook to the north as we're approaching the intersection with 321, just to give you a better idea of what we're looking at here. River on the left-hand side, you can see the really steep embankment between kind of the back of the guardrail at Niley Cook there and the river. So it's a 1-to-1 slope or greater. So if we were over there, we'd probably need to be on kind of an elevated boardwalk. And we've got utility lines crossing Niley Cook, and then again, exposed rock on the north side of Niley Cook Road there. As we make our way up, now we're kind of at the intersection with US 321 and Niley Cook Road. We're facing north, so towards Boone at this intersection. Looking at things like roadway grade, sight distance, traffic speed, and volume, not a great place based on all of those considerations for kind of any kind of at-grade crossing mid-block. I don't think NCDOT is going to allow that. The other kind of option for at-grade crossing would be at a signalized intersection. And this particular intersection right now, I don't think NCDOT would say that it would meet the warrants to install a signal there. So what we would really be looking at doing is trying to figure out a way to get a grade separated crossing of US 321. So there's a couple different ways we can grade separate, right? We can go over with a pedestrian bridge, or we can go kind of under with a tunnel. So here, as you're looking north in the background, you can see we do have high ground to high ground. So that kind of opens up the possibility for a potential bridge over US 321. And then this is the same location, but now we're kind of facing south towards Blowing Rock at that intersection with Niley Cook. So now we're looking at, you can see kind of the curve coming around, again, not great sight distance, traffic speed and volume through there, and just not conducive to an at-grade crossing. We obviously don't have high ground to high ground on this side when we're looking, but we do have potential for a tunnel. So we did look at potentially using the existing culvert that the river already flows through below 321. That culvert's only about 25 feet wide, and our trail would be 10 feet plus a little bit more for shoulders. So from a hydraulic capacity standpoint, that probably would not work out the best. It may not work with the flood study. The other kind of challenge with trying to utilize that existing culvert as a tunnel underneath is when we pop out on the west side or the right-hand side of your screen here, the elevation difference to get from the river back up to grade is really significant. And there's really just not a lot of room to get the switchbacks to get up. There's a couple buildings on that bank as well. So probably not going to be able to use the existing culvert. So the other option would be to install a new pedestrian tunnel kind of above the existing culvert. What that would allow us to do is kind of stay up on the north side of the river. And then as we cross 321, we could actually also diagonally cross the river and end up on the southern or the western bank of the river, where there's more room to come up and kind of make up that grade with a gentler switchback, and then kind of follow 321 up towards Boone. The tunnel kind of considerations there, given the topography on either side and just limited area to work, it's not going to really be able to be a jack and bore tunnel, but more of a cut and cover tunnel. And so, when we start to talk about cut and cover, we need to start thinking about things like impacts to traffic, potential lane closures, that kind of thing. And all of that would need to be coordinated with NCDOT. And then moving up to the end of segment 5 south here on the north end, where we're trying to connect to Payne Branch Park. That's the river on the left-hand side of the screen at Payne Branch Park. We would ultimately need an at-grade crossing of Payne Branch Road to connect to that existing natural surface trail at the park. Again, kind of the constraints here, a little bit windy road, limited sight distance. We do have aero utilities along that side of the road as well. And then on the northern side of or southern side of the road there, you can see the steeper embankment. So just some topography issues to deal with as well. The next section of segment 5 is what we're calling segment 5 north. And so this goes from Payne Branch Park to Jordan B. Cook Road. So the photo on the left there, kind of starting up in the distance there, that's the parking area at Payne Branch Park. We'd look to kind of utilize that existing dirt roadbed on the left-hand side of the street to kind of come down and then cross that paved driveway that you see and continue heading north towards the future Boone Gorge Park. The right-hand side of the screen is, as we've continued north, this is an abandoned aerial utility crossing over the river. Looking at the flood model studies there, this would also be a pretty good place to install the pedestrian bridge to cross, just because the floodway and floodplain narrow in this location. But we would kind of look to cross the river here and then continue north. And then the photo on the left-hand side of the screen here, as we're continuing north, making our way to the future Boone Gorge Park. This is just a really scenic area that Wendy took us to. Would love for folks to be able to see and enjoy this. The trail itself would probably be on the mountain behind the river there, but potential opportunity for an overlook or a smaller hiking trail down to the river. On the right-hand side, that's a photo kind of down in the bottomlands where future Boone Gorge Park would be. This would be an area where we'd look to have a bridge coming off the mountain and kind of land in the bottomlands here. So crossing back over to the east side of the river in this location. The photo on the left here, this is actually down where the future Boone Gorge Park would be in the bottomlands. We looked at a couple different opportunities there, one kind of following the river. The second option being kind of following the tree line there on the right-hand side of the image, make it more of a through movement. As it becomes the park, there's plenty of opportunity for kind of connection and loop trails that would kind of go throughout the park property there. Right-hand photo, this is kind of moving to the north end of that parcel that will become the park. Looking at the existing Old Blowing Rock Road bridge over the river. Super narrow, not really enough room to kind of cheat and buy some space to accommodate the greenway on that bridge. So what we'd probably be looking to do is install a standalone pedestrian bridge on the west side of that bridge, or on the left hand side of that image, connecting over to Niley Cook. You'll see again aerial utility lines that will need to be coordinated with. And then as we kind of make our way towards 321, we'd kind of follow Niley Cook Road, go between the road and the river there. Topography is pretty challenging. It's probably going to be a more expensive elevated boardwalk section as well. Then we kind of get up to 321, have to get across, again, for all the reasons mentioned at the last crossing of 321, not great for an at-grade crossing. So looking to do grade separated. Here, the existing culvert that the river uses to flow beneath 321 is about 75 feet wide. And so we feel a lot more confident that we'd be able to use part of that tunnel to install the greenway and connect over to the east side of 321 and that future segment of the greenway over to the medical center. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jimmy. He's going to kind of talk you guys through the typical cross sections and then some of the route alternatives that were developed based on all of the observations that we just went through.
All right, thanks, Andrew. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep.
Awesome. Well, I apologize, I'm not on video. Unfortunately, I had some technical difficulties with that, but I'm just glad to be here in some capacity. So as Andrew mentioned, I'm going to take over and kind of talk about some typical cross section we've developed, as well as pull up some maps and show you some route alternatives later on. So based on all these opportunities and constraints, as well as the field observations that Andrew's run through, we've had the chance to develop both of these, and we're excited to show them to you. So we'll start with the typical cross sections. We have 4 to show you today. We have 2 for the main line, a preferred and an alternate. And we also have 2 different types of structures and a boardwalk and a pedestrian bridge to show. So we'll start off with our mainline preferred. This will be a 10-foot wide paved trail. And this is just recommended basically, long-term maintenance is a lot less. And this also has a greater eligibility from a wide variety of funding sources, as mentioned before. There's 2 different types of pavement that could be used on this preferred section, both asphalt and concrete. Now, asphalt would be used along the majority of the length, and it's recommended based on site conditions, anticipated trail use, as well as cost considerations. And there would be limited sections of concrete, such as areas such as under underpasses or areas where flooding might be a little bit more likely, and higher velocity waters might interact with the trail, just because concrete tends to hold up a little bit better in those situations. If we look over to the right, you can see kind of a generic rendering of this. You can see a 10-foot width, and then you'll notice on either side of the 10 feet, there's a 2-foot shy zone or a shoulder. Now these are to kind of help keep the trail clear of any obstacles and ensure the full trail width, it remains usable over its life. So next we'll go to the alternate mainline section, which is a slightly narrower 8-foot wide natural surface trail. And this is going to be a section that, although the initial cost is going to be a little bit cheaper than a full paved, the overall life cycle cost may be a little bit higher due to things associated with more maintenance being required, just due to some environmental factors such as surface drainage and things like that. So as mentioned, a 10-foot paved has the widest availability for funding. That doesn't mean that this 8-foot natural surface section is not eligible. However, you could utilize primarily local and or private funding for these sections, and utilize labor forces as funding and real estate constraints allow. So over to the right, you can see an 8-foot compacted aggregate trail. And if you look at the real life image in the top right-hand corner, this is the type of surface that you might be used to seeing in some parks. It's great for hiking. It's also possible to ride a bike on this. So, and same with the 10-foot section, you can see a 2-foot shy zone or shoulder on either side. So now we'll move to the first structure, which would be a boardwalk. This would feature a 10-foot clear width from rail to rail. It will be used in situations such as crossing wetlands, approaching bridge crossings in the floodplain floodway area, which occurs frequently over the course of this project. And also used in areas where you cross steep topography, which is very common. And it essentially allows you to limit your 2D footprint, reduce limits of clearing and grading. So the deck surface for these boardwalk would be concrete. And that's just because it has a greater friction, and it also reduces the risk of falling and slipping. And overall long-term, there's not as much of a burden with maintenance compared to materials such as timber when you do use that concrete. So this would be a primarily timber structure aside from the concrete deck. You'd have timber safety rails, handrails as shown over to the right, as well as a timber pile substructure system. But just a disclaimer, the substructure design and materials do vary just depending on specific site conditions and geotechnical recommendations further down the line. And next, we'll look at our pedestrian bridge. This will also feature a 10-foot clear width and will be used where we cross from one side of the Middle Fork River over to the other, which we'll see in the maps happens a few times. These prefabricated steel truss bridges are very common. They're a cost-effective bridge type, and they're recommended in this type of applications. So over to the right, you'll notice kind of like a rustic red tint to this bridge. This is actually not paint. This is a Corten weathering steel, which is a finish that should be considered just for its ability to really blend well with the natural surroundings, and also has minimal maintenance requirements long-term as compared to bridges that are painted. And just the same as the boardwalk, we would recommend a concrete deck on these bridges. And along with the same disclaimer, the bridge substructure design and materials do vary a lot, just depending on the bridge design type, specific site conditions, and geotechnical recommendations as well. So those were kind of our 4 typical sections. Now we'll kind of move in and look at some maps and show you some route alternatives. So essentially, for each section, there's all these little miniature segments that you combine in different ways and then come up with an overall alternative. So for section 3 on the southern end, we have 6 alternatives to show you. For section 5 south, we also have 6 alternatives. And then for section 5 north, the furthest north section, we have 1 recommended route to share with you today. And Andrew will get into this a little bit more later, but we would just like to let you know this all will be open for feedback until May 20th. And your feedback on these alternatives is vital and much appreciated. So we'll go ahead and get into these maps. Just to go ahead and kind of orient us over to the left, you'll see a map with a predominant color. In this case, it'll be red. It'll change throughout the different alternatives, but that'll kind of be the highlighted alternative that we'll focus on. And you'll also see some dashed gray lines. Now, those are kind of the smaller segments that you'll see that can be pieced together and will be part of other alternatives later on. But just to kind of generally orient us, the solid yellow orange line through the center is 321 for this section. The Middle Fork River is a light blue. And as I mentioned before, each alternative on the screen will be kind of a solid color. So just to go ahead and bring attention to some of the differences in this section, kind of between Aho Road and Mac Hampton Road. And then up north to Dexter Drive, we will see a couple different combinations and options. So to speak, if you're to turn left or turn right, and you'll see that as we go through the map. So there's opportunities where you can follow the river for longer periods of time. And there's other opportunities where you can go along 321 just based on those opportunities constraints Andrew mentioned earlier. So we'll get started with alternative A here. You'll see kind of on the bottom side of the screen, we'll kind of start east of the river behind Faith Bridge United Methodist. And at the very bottom, you'll notice there's a potential for a connection trail over to the Blue Ridge Conservancy. Then we'll have our first bridge crossing, which will kind of tie us over just near the Mustard Seed. And then we'll ultimately continue along under Aho Road, where there was a new bridge recently constructed. And this alternative will actually follow along the river, cross Mac Hampton at grade, continue following along the west side of the river, and then cross over with a pedestrian bridge to the east. Once it crosses to the east, it'll utilize that existing road bed along Jennifer Lane to go all the way up to Dexter Drive. I do want to go ahead and bring attention to the potential trailhead, which is kind of a black in the center of the screen there. There's a real good opportunity here just based on an existing embankment from some roadway construction years ago to get a trailhead with around 16 spaces, and that would feature kind of a ride-in, ride-out scenario for getting into park off of 321. All of our alternatives do connect into that. This specific alternative features a bridge over the Middle Fork and a small boardwalk to tie up. So you'll see that throughout the rest of the alternatives for this section. But this one specifically does require an additional connection to connect over to that. And looking at the north end of this alternative from Dexter Drive, you'll notice that we continue along. We do require a bridge to cross over to the north side of the Middle Fork and eventually tie down into the existing greenway there near Sterling Creek Park. So now we'll move on to alternative B. And you'll notice just slight differences between all these. And that's what I'll try to point out as we move through these. So different from alternative A, alternative B here follows along the river all the way up to Mac Hampton Drive. And instead of continuing to follow along the river, we actually head up towards 321 and run along 321, connect into the trailhead and cross over to the east side with a bridge just further north than the previous alternative. And we'll move over to alternative C. Alternative C is almost identical to alternative B. However, the difference here is between Aho Road and Mac Hampton. Instead of continuing along the river there, after you get under the underpass at Aho, you actually take what would be a left as we're looking at it and head up to a right along 321 and continue along 321 all the way to get north of the trailhead and eventually cross back over to the east side of the river. We'll go to alternative D. So this one, you get under Aho. Instead of following along the river between there and Mac Hampton, you actually follow 321. But as opposed to the previous two, after you get to Mac Hampton, you actually follow along the river and cross over with that further south bridge and continue along Jennifer Lane. So very similar to alternative A, just a small section that deviates from the river along there. So we'll move into the last two alternatives here with alternative E. So for alternative E, you follow along the river up to Mac Hampton Road, deviate a little bit towards 321, but still cross back over to the east side there a little bit sooner than a few of the previous options. So very similar here. Just a short section of this north of Hampton does deviate from the river and follow along 321. And then lastly, we'll get into alternative F for section 3, which will take you under AHO, start to begin to follow along 321, cross Hampton at grade, continue to follow along 321, and then utilize that bridge there south of the Blue Ridge Conservancy parcel, which is highlighted in green where the trailhead will be. And then that will continue up to eventually tie down into Sterling Creek Park. So those are kind of our 6 alternatives for section 3. Now we'll move further north up to section 5 south, which will cover from Gold Mine Branch Park, Nollycook Road, up to Payne Branch Park. So as compared to section 3, the scale of this section is a little bit larger. So we did want to break section 5 into both the north and south portion. So just to kind of orient ourselves, the biggest constraint, which Andrew mentioned previously with this section, is crossing 321. So we want to have a grade separated crossing, and we have 2 alternatives out of the 6, or excuse me, 2 alternatives in general that'll bring us up to a pedestrian bridge that will cross over 321. And then we also have some options that'll bring us to the pedestrian tunnel, kind of where the Middle Fork River crosses under currently where the existing culvert is. So as we look at alternative A here, this option, we start at Gold Mine Branch Park. We actually, instead of following along the river, we actually see an at-grade crossing at Nollycook, and then we begin to follow the terrain up Mine Branch Road, cross at grade at Mine Branch Road, then continue to make our climb up to eventually set up that pedestrian bridge from high ground to high ground over 321. So once we cross over to the west side of 321, we kind of descend down parallel to 321. And then you'll see on the first 3 alternatives for this section, as we descend from 321 down to Payne Branch Park, there are 2 different switchback alternatives. One in which you descend, it's the same amount of elevation being descended, but just 2 different ways to approach it. So one in which you descend down and approach a mid-block crossing of Payne Branch Road from the south or the west, and then one in which you approach from the north. So for alternative A here, we have the option where after you cross over the bridge over 321, you descend down and approach Payne Branch Park from the south or the west, utilizing a switchback system. And once you get over across Payne Branch Road, the trail will follow the existing natural surface trail alignment kind of to the parking area at Payne Branch Park, or for those familiar, where the dam used to be. So now we'll go to alternative B. The biggest difference here is our approach up to this pedestrian bridge over 321. So instead of kind of deviating from the river and climbing up a different way, this alternative will follow along the riverbank between Nollycook Road and the river, and eventually wind up crossing Nollycook at grade. It'll follow along the north or west side of, or excuse me, east side of 321 here for a short period. And then you'll see 2 switchbacks to make a quick climb up to set up that high ground to high ground bridge crossing. And after that, this alternative B features the same descent down towards Payne Branch Park as the previous. So then we'll go ahead and take a look at alternative C, which will feature our proposed pedestrian tunnel under 321. This is very similar to alternative B in that it extends from Gold Mine Branch Park along the riverbank. And ultimately, instead of going up to Nollycook, it actually, as Andrew mentioned before, it sets up that pedestrian tunnel, which will kind of sit above that existing culvert. And as you get to the west side there, you climb out of the hole, so to speak, up to 321 via Riverview Lane. You're able to follow along the west side of 321 for a short period with kind of a side path scenario, and then you're able to descend down to Payne Branch Park as the same way as alternative A and B. And now we'll move into alternative D. So the biggest difference between D, E, and F and A, B, and C here is just the descent kind of towards the left, upper left side of the screen, the descent from 321 down to Payne Branch Park. So alternative D here features where we extend from Gold Mine Branch Park. We kind of climb up away from the river to set up the bridge crossing. We descend from the bridge over 321. And as opposed to approaching Payne Branch Road from the south or the west, we approach it from the north. So it just utilizes a little bit of a different switchback system to get down the same amount of elevation. An alternative E here features the same way to get out of Gold Mine Branch Park, get up to the bridge, be a little different route. Once you get over the bridge, you come down and you descend the same way as alternative D to approach Pan Branch Park mid-block crossing from the north. And then lastly, alternative F. This will feature the proposed pedestrian tunnel under 321 option. So following along the river, climbing up from the river to run along 321 for a short period of time, and then descending down towards Pan Branch Park via the same switchback system that approaches it from the north as alternative D and E. So those are alternatives for section 5 south. I think now we'll move into section 5 north, where we have a solid green line here, no alternatives to show you, just a recommended route. So this on the bottom of the screen is kind of where our last one ended there at Pan Branch Park. So the alignment here will start there. We'll set up a bridge crossing to the west side of the river, and then kind of between bridge to bridge here, we'll follow the mountain terrain, kind of say high and dry is what we like to say, and avoid any stream buffer impacts, avoid any direct interaction with the river. And ultimately, we'll have another bridge to cross over to the north side and descend down into Boone Gorge Park here. And once we get into Boone Gorge Park, we kind of follow the bottom lands and connect to a potential trailhead, which you'll see as the kind of solid black area here, which we believe can accommodate anywhere from 50 to 60 parking spaces. And there's also the potential to have a loop connections and trail system throughout the park that kind of takes you down to interact with the river more through here. So leaving Boone Gorge Park, we actually use a pedestrian bridge that's adjacent to the existing Old Boiling Rock Bridge, which Andrew mentioned before, is very narrow and unlikely to accommodate pedestrians and bicyclists safely. So setting this new bridge up next to that, you cross over to the north side of the river. And then from there, you follow along Jordan V. Cook Road between the road and the river with a boardwalk system that ultimately descends under that beautiful arched culvert under 321. And then you come out and you connect up to the Greenway that will wind up at the Watauga Medical Center. And something I forgot to mention on the previous slide is over to the right side of the screen, you'll see the potential for an East Loop Trail. That's kind of that brownish green, white line. That's an option that works with all of the proposed bridge options on the previous section, and also works with this and could, potentially create a great little loop for this section 5. So those are all of our route alternatives, and I'll go ahead and hand it over to Andrew. He'll talk about the evaluation criteria.
Thanks, Jenny. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
All right. So now that we've kind of gone over the route alternatives, we need to have a way to evaluate those. So I wanted to touch, this is just a few of the things that we look at when we're evaluating them and kind of figuring out what recommendations to make. The first is cost. So not just how much it costs to construct, but kind of the total life cycle cost, including design, permitting, and ongoing maintenance. The next one, property impacts. So how well does the alternative use existing publicly owned properties, existing easements, public right of way, and how much can it limit impact to private property owners. The third one there at the bottom are the environmental impacts. So what is the impact each one of those alternatives is going to have on streams, wetlands, and other jurisdictional features? That includes things like the trout stream buffers, as well as the floodplain elevations. And then the next slide here, continuing on with the evaluation criteria, community priorities. So just to kind of ensure consistency with public preferences and existing plans, goals identified in those previous planning efforts, and the feedback that we get from the public and other stakeholders. We want to take all of that into consideration when making our recommendations. Desired connectivity, again, just want to make sure that what we're recommending is actually connecting all the things that people want to go to and where they might come from. Traffic impacts, probably not as big of a deal on this one as compared to some of the other bike ped projects where you're proposing road diets with dropping a lane of traffic to accommodate bike ped. Here, it would be more about kind of the temporary impacts and traffic control. So primarily thinking about that section 5 south there. Obviously, the impact of digging a cut and cover tunnel there would be greater than setting a bridge across. Implementation timeframe. So each one of these, relative to one another, can take longer to plan, fund, design, and ultimately construct. So I want to take that into consideration. in conjunction with, community priorities and, what the expectation is and how long is a tolerable time to wait for overall project completion. Accessibility, that's a really big one. So convenience of use and being able to accommodate users of all ages and abilities. Want to make sure that what we ultimately put down is a community amenity that is designed for universal use and can be used by all. And then lastly, here we have placemaking and user experience. So certain alternatives might be more visible to passersby on the traffic there. Others may stay further away, but start trying to think about the ability of any of these alternatives to help drive tourism, contribute to the local economy, and really brand the surrounding area as one that promotes healthy, active lifestyles, which I think the existing sections of Middle Fork Greenway are already doing a great job of. So in the report, you'll ultimately see kind of an evaluation matrix. And what this does is it kind of lays out all the alternatives across the top there. And then down the left-hand side, you'll see all the different kind of evaluation criteria. And we'd go through and kind of rank or score these based on each of those criteria. High being the most desirable, medium, and then low being the least desirable. So what this will provide is kind of a quick at a glance, what are the pros and cons from the perspective of all the different evaluation criteria there. So you can kind of compare all of them at once. And with that, I think we've covered most of the information that we had to present today. I'm going to kind of turn over and talk about input opportunities. So we do have a survey, as Wendy mentioned. You guys can scan the QR code that's on this slide, or you can go to Middle Fork Greenway's website at middleforkgreenway.org to take the survey. There's already a link there ready to go. That survey includes a little exercise for you guys to prioritize those evaluation criteria so we can kind of understand which of those is the most important to you. There's an opportunity to review the maps with the different route alternatives that Jimmy went over and provide any comments that you have on those alternatives. And then there's also some questions for just general project feedback and any other comments that you might have. And again, that survey will stay open until next Friday, May 20th. And then I just want to say thanks so much for your time today. We're really excited to be working on this project. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, our contact information is here. You can reach out to Wendy or myself. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Wendy for any closing remarks.
Thank you very much for that presentation. If you could go back to the previous slide where the QR code is, if you just put your cell phone up to that, you can take a picture of that QR code. It'll take you directly to the survey. The survey is only, I think it's 8 questions. Is that correct? And
It's 7 or 8.
Yep, you can take that survey right on your phone or on your computer. It's really important information for us to use your information that you want as part of this evaluation criteria and evaluation process. So I appreciate everyone taking this hour to listen on these updates. You know where to find me. I'm at Blue Ridge Conservancy over here in Blowing Rock. You can call me, you can email me. We can set up a meeting if you want more information. So I appreciate y'all being here today, and we'll keep you posted as things progress with the Middle Fork Greenway. All right, so we can shut that down now, and we'll see you all out on the trail. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Wendy.